Today we're looking at creating the large masses that carry a painting, that really make a painting work. It's the most important aspect of painting, so much more important than the color choices we make or the brush technique we use. It's how we see our subject when we're outside photographing, because that's really where it starts. And I'm talking pretty much working from photographs. I mean, the same thing holds true for painting outside, but we want to be able to see the large masses that we can use to make the painting work before we even take the photograph. And too often, and I've been guilty of this over the decades, when I'm on a painting trip of just photographing things that I fall in love with, a tree or a detail on something, and it's just not a reference that has any ability to create large masses with it. And I see that a lot in students' work too, getting caught up in the detail or the color, or there's some sentimental attachment to the area, but there's just nothing there to make a painting out of. That's kind of the litmus test. If you can look at a photograph or look at an area that you want to photograph, and if you can see the large masses or see the ability to create large masses in there despite the detail, then you know it's going to make a good painting. And a painting will work if you can have a good design of the large shapes or masses. That's the basis of a good painting. Whether your color's very good or not that we want bad color, but it's the designing of the large shapes that matters. Now, the large masses, the big shapes are most important, but there is the detail that we need to add on top of that. And that is important also. I don't want to say that detail does not matter, because it really does. It's the icing on the cake. It's what gives the painting maybe the individual look, how we apply the detail and the subtle changes. That creates kind of the beauty in the large masses, but those large masses come first. Look at a couple of paintings here. These are 3 paintings by Victor Higgins. He was a Taoist painter, early 20th century. And you can see his shapes are very big, very simple. Not a lot of detail to them, although, around the focal point down in here, where there is more detail, that's where the focal point is, because that's where you're going to have most of the detail. So when you move away from the focal point, which the focal point is where all the detail is and the sharpest contrast, as you move away, there's less and less detail. But there's still some subtle things going on in the sky, even though the sky's empty. There's that subtle value change, a little bit of subtle color change from kind of a blue-green to a blue. And that's very important, and it's that subtlety that makes it work. Also, along with the large masses, and again, by the large masses in this painting, you got the large mass of the sky, the light adobe color, and then you got the dark adobe mass in there. And that's a bit more intricate, but it's still simplified. Now, the details he adds comes on top of that. The ladder, the stuff hanging off here, the little dots and dashes of sunlight and shadow. And that's what gives it its individual look, but it's those large masses that make it work. I don't mean to say that detail is not important. It really is, but it's not going to work if we can't establish those masses first. And too often we start painting and we're enamored with the color or the detail, or trying to render. We can be way too enamored with a reality, with trying to make it look real. And that really kills painting. And that took me a long time to kind of get over also. It's that design of the large masses, shapes, that big shadow pattern that runs through those large masses. And then the elimination of stuff is very important. And then finally the detail. We tend to get that all mixed up. Now, this is another Victor Higgins, and he's going as minimal as possible, but still trying to create a good painting, a good representation of these shapes within the snow, and of course this real strong shape of the creek. I mean, it's a real strong painting. Contrast is very strong. The design is really strong. It's the lack of detail here. There's not much detail going on in the snow. Some choppy brushwork in the shrubbery up here, which creates a little bit of detail, but it's still very large and more value-oriented. and some detail down here. But it's that lack of detail that creates the design that makes it really, really work. And the less we do with the design, the stronger the design's going to be. Now, that doesn't mean you can't add more detail, but just know that the more detail you add, the weaker the design is. But I still think the detail is important. But after we add the detail, those big shapes still need to be real evident. It's another Victor Higgins along the same line. Very simple. But the design is very strong. Even though there's not much value change, really emphasizes these kind of half-rolling hills as they go back to the figures here on horses and then the trees. I mean, he's trying to design with as little detail as possible, but still make it work. And again, you can see in paintings like this, the design is the most important thing because there's very little detail. And I really like these because there is some subtlety in here going on that's, hard to do, but the lack of detail and the little bits of detail he does do, like in here, and of course the horses and the riders, and some down in here, does not take away from the design. So these are kind of extremes. Victor Higgins paintings during certain periods were just very simplistic, and the design was very strong. Now this is an Edgar Payne, and his design is just as strong, but it has a lot of detail. There's a lot of little value changes in here. They're very subtle, which makes it better. In other words, there's not too many of these real strong dark and light dots and dashes that will break up the large shapes. And you can see the detail, the value change within the shadow here, the little dark and light value changes in the trees and rocks down in here. But his detail does not interfere with those big masses. The big mass of the sky, the big shadow pattern on the rock, the big light pattern. And that also what makes up the large masses is pattern. You want to look for pattern, in this case of shadow, pattern of light snow against a little darker rock, pattern of rock and shrubbery in the foreground. That all makes up those large masses. And this has quite a bit of pattern, usually because of snow and rocks, that creates more pattern. But while he has some detail in the shadows, again, detail is value change. He's got a lot of little value changes in there. The detail is not so much that it takes away from the large masses. There's detail in here with a lot of little dark and light shapes, but it doesn't take away from the big overall shape. And if we compare that with this has a lot less detail, and you can see the design is a lot stronger. And this one, the design is still really strong, but there's more detail. But the detail doesn't interfere with designing those large masses. If you get too many value changes in here, too many little darks and lights in here, then pretty soon you don't have that big contrast of that dark and light shape of the big masses. It breaks down into smaller shapes, and those smaller details, smaller dark and light shapes, is what kills the large pattern. So this has detail, but it doesn't interfere with the large masses. This has virtually no detail, this one and this one. And the design is a lot stronger, but virtually no detail to speak of. And I think both work real well, but I'm not saying don't use detail. What I'm saying is don't let the detail destroy those large masses. A couple of more paintings here by Frederick Mulhaupt. He was not well known. At least I didn't know him very well until the last 10, 15 years. East Coast painter, American painter. And he also has a lot of detail, but a lot of big, simple masses. And the first mass here is the dark in the foreground, the shadow. All the foreground is in shadow, pretty much. A few sail over here that has light in it. And then the big light water here. And then the simple shape of the hillside with the reflections in the water. And then the shape and masses of the sky and clouds. Clouds create smaller masses, but they're still masses. There's a value change between the sky and the clouds. And then the sails, and then around the sails, the house, the boat. So there's about, 6 or 7, maybe 8, I didn't count them, large masses there. But he's broken them up with a lot of detail. But you can still see those large masses. So the lights and darks within the shadow here in the foreground is not overly done. In other words, still a lot of detail and it breaks it up, but this large shadow mass still holds together. Same thing with the water. There's 3 or 4 values in the water, but they're somewhat close together, and it doesn't distract from the overall shape and mass of the water. Same thing with the hillside. Getting close to being way too picky. It just starts to fall apart a little bit, but still that big shape here of the reflection in the water and the hillside with the houses and trees in it still holds together as a mass. And then the simplest mass sticks out the most, the sails. That's your focal point, is more right in here with the dark contrast of some of the boat parts here and the real bright sunlit sails in the background. And then around the focal point, the building, the dock, the boat itself is kind of secondary. It doesn't compete with the sails. And there is detail. There's value change. But you don't need as much of it. You could get away with a lot more. Not that I think his detail is distracting, but you can get rid of a lot of it. I'm going to glaze over kind of a dark halftone. And that makes the sail pop out more. I still have a house back in here with a roof and the side walls. Might want a few more dark accents down in here, but you can see that kind of pulls it together. Same thing with this hillside here. If I were to kind of lose some of the lights and the darks, those little small accents, and kind of pull it together, you can see that makes that mass easier to read. Kind of pulls everything together more. Now the sail even pops out more, although I don't think he added too much detail. He has detail, but it doesn't take away from the large masses. I still think it works real well. Pretty busy, though, with all these little value changes within the dark. But he didn't overdo it. I don't think it destroys the big mass dark shape in the foreground that makes the painting work. This is another Friedrich Malhaupt. Again, a lot of broken brush strokes. I think the key is, while he has detail in here of all these subtle value changes of kind of an orange, red-orange in here, the kind of value changes on the real light bridge. There's some green, there's some orange, there's some light violet. Same thing in here, this dark pattern, which holds together real well. There's still some variation of value and color in there, but not so much that it breaks it up, that you lose the big pattern. The sunlit bridge, the real light bridge, stands out from the dark here, the kind of halftone light of the grass, the dark and lighter dark, the shadows of the trees. He's broken it up, more detail, but not so much that it loses those big shapes that make the composition work. Now, if he gets more value change down in here, more smaller darks and lights that have more extreme values, then he's going to lose it. Same thing in the shadows. If he has a lot more value changes within the shadow, he's going to lose that big mass. Still works, and the detail is important. It kind of establishes his view of this. There's more emotion in the detail, but it's not the detail that makes it work. It's similar with color and value. It's not the color that makes it work. It's what value the color is that makes it work. And same thing with objects. The bigger, simpler masses are what make the composition work. And again, when we add detail, that finishes it, but it's not what makes it work. It's that simplicity that we find first. So now we look at a few photographs here, thinking about the simplicity. The first thing we want to do is compose those big shapes correctly. We want to find an interesting composition or arrangements of those shapes. And you have several different types of photographs, or when you take a photograph, what you're going to do with them. One is like this, where the big patterns are very evident. The shape down here, the foreground grass, the lighter hill, the pattern, big pattern shape of these trees in here, lighter, distant trees, and then the dark and light shapes of the mountains in the sky. Everything is set up in big shapes and patterns already. Now the key is, how do I crop it? Or what do I look for to change slightly or move a little bit? And the first thing I want to do is decide where my focal point is. There are a lot of horses, which I would probably add, but they weren't what drew me to the composition. What drew me was the pattern of trees against these light rolling hills. kind of right in this area, maybe even a bit bigger in there. So that's my focal point. That's what I want to change the least. If I have to change the shape or do some creative changing on the focal point area, or at least too much, then I might as well not paint it. And you have to have an idea that's there from nature. Then I can change things as they surround. In other words, I can get rid of a lot of stuff back in here, get rid of stuff up in here, and maybe over on the sides. But this area is what I'm taking from nature. That's what I'm using. And I'll stay true to what's there, but I won't hesitate to simplify things a lot more around it. So if I look at this compositionally, I have way too much foreground, way too much stuff over here on the right side. My area of interest is more in here, kind of over to the left or just left of center. So I think more of a vertical view would actually be better than horizontal. Horizontal would give me, even if I crop out some of the mountains and foreground, horizontal view still gives me too much on the right side here. I've really gotten away from the interest here. And I would probably do several thumbnails to see what would work best. But I think a kind of a cross section of the depth here, the foreground rolling hills, the pattern of the trees, the background hills, would give me more of what draws me to that scene. To me, I find that a lot more interesting because this is more, and it's bigger now, of the areas that in nature that drew me to that scene. And I could add the horses in there, but this would still be the center of interest. And that doesn't mean I can't come up with another painting that's more horizontal. I would just crop a lot more. And I would lose the sky here with the horizontal, because to get the horizontal shape and have the sky, I would be seeing way too much. And this works well too. Maybe still a bit too much over here on the right, but not as much as before I cropped it. I still like the vertical shape a little bit better. Now going to another one here. This is another one where the patterns are pretty well defined. You can see bigger, more simpler patterns when you're looking slightly into the sun. And I don't mean looking directly into the sun. Everything gets washed out. But the sun is way over here, but it's in front. It's over to the side, but in front. If it goes more to the side, directly to the side or behind me, you kind of lose that dark and light contrast. But here you can see the big pattern of the background hills, big pattern of the sky, the tall vertical pine trees, the smaller shrubbery, all in here, and then of course the flat ground and the water. And that's, 5 or 6 shapes. I can see that pattern, those big masses, and decide where I want most of the detail. But this is similar to the other photograph, that I think a vertical works a little better because my focal point is right in here. Some of these trees, some of the water and the reflection, and the contrast of the flat plane, a little bit of the background. That's more my focal point. So to catch all that, a little more of a vertical, maybe square, I think would be a lot better because what there's way too much of here also is the sun. So really look at your composition and decide your photograph and decide what shape would make the best composition. You could do a vertical one here also, but you would lose the sky and a lot of the foreground. This one needs more simplification, but deciding right away that my center of interest is more right in this area, is more of my center of interest. And somewhere in there. So I want to get rid of, in this case, a lot of stuff that's not as interesting. I don't have to crop as much, although I think I would crop. But to find the large masses, this is not as easy to find the large masses as with the other two photographs. This one, the first thing I would do is just establish the large mass of the shadow on the flat plane and the light area on the flat plane. I don't care about the grass. The grass is way too detail-oriented and very distracting. It really takes away from that shadow pattern, which is real important to establish the light. Then establishing the dark trees here, kind of in the middle ground and the foreground. And this reads so much better, even though I would add more detail than this. But I have to establish the painting this way first, as opposed to that. Way too many little dots and dashes of detail in there. So getting rid of that is the first thing, and establishing the bigger masses of these trees. And you want to think in terms of, when I design them, the different variety of shape of the lights in the middle ground trees, shape of the lights in the foreground trees, and the shape of the dark. I don't want them all the same height, all the same width, equally spaced apart. So that's where the changes come in. That's where I will move things, take things out to create that variation of distance, mass, shape. I also want to decide in my painting, am I going to have more shadow or more sunlight? I don't want it half and half. And this one will have more shadow. The light areas are less. Or I could have turned the camera a little bit more to the right and have more sunlight and less shadow, but you don't want half and half. That kind of kills the design. Goes along with the idea of you don't want things centered, equal mass on either side. But the same thing with the shadows. You don't want equal mass of dark and light. So make sure you're creating more of one or the other. And then lastly, the background. Creating simple dark and light mass, sky. And here I would probably crop this a bit more, get rid of some of the sky, some of the image on the right and the left, and maybe a little bit of the foreground, so that I'm zooming in on what's important. Making the tree area here bigger where the trunk is, the shadow pattern. A lot of pattern in this also. But again, you have the big masses of sky, dark and light hills, dark and light trees, dark and light foreground. But then you also have the big pattern of the shadow, which unifies everything. So looking for those two masses, big masses of the shapes of the objects, and then the big mass of the shadow pattern. And they kind of go hand in hand. I mean, the dark and light hills and the dark and light trees, the shadow pattern is connected in both of them. And then it connects into the foreground trees and then the foreground flat plane. But if this was a cloudy day and we didn't have that big shadow pattern, we would still have the big masses of sky, hill, trees, and flat plane. Everything would just be more subtle and be more halftone oriented. So as we do the thumbnails, really keep in mind you're looking for big masses you can design. And zooming in, I think it's not that you can't have a big panoramic view, but you can zoom in with fewer shapes, 4 or 5 shapes, and still have a really good design and pattern. The less detail or the elimination of detail to start with is what you want. Now, when you add the detail at the end, I think that's what gives it more of the beauty, more of a personal touch to it, and it's very important. But if that detail takes over the large masses, then you've ruined your painting. So keep that in mind.